Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the first segment of Ancient Origins, Unraveling Earth History with Brandon Hall. I'm 𝗫𝗫𝗁𝗍 with CS1 Cybercom, and I'm hosting tonight's talk along with Brandon's wife, Kimberly Hall. Before Brandon and Kimberly begin, I'm going to provide a little introduction to give you some idea of what's going to be shared here, because this is definitely no ordinary history lesson. As a true Earth historian, Brandon's extensive and comprehensive database includes information he's gathered from his multidimensional perceptions, time travel experiences, his soul memories, downloads he receives from his DNA or cellular memory, channeled information from his higher self, and a whole lot of historical research. He has a vast amount of knowledge about the beginning of life on this world, from the high vibrational beings that created this reality and eventually inhabited the planet, to each and every civilization that followed, including how the beings from other dimensions affected our world and how each society and culture that came after them have impacted one another. Brandon is also the author of an engaging book series. Although the novels are published under the guise of sci-fi fantasy, they actually recount his own soul's journey, something he only began to realize after meeting Kimberly. The main character is part of a lineage that spans the dawn of time. He has to find his connection to that lineage in a particular time period, then return to the current timeline in order to awaken himself and ultimately the collective consciousness. Throughout these stories, Brandon takes his readers on a journey through Earth's true history, providing a comprehensive view of this planet's ancient origins. He goes all the way back to the beginning, to what he refers to as the Age of Horizon, a time when men and women were gods, or beings from other dimensional planes of existence, and Earth was their playground. In that light, Kimberly is going to read specific sections regarding Earth's history from Brandon's second book, Genesis, and he'll be expanding upon that information, delving deep into this fascinating topic. The journey begins not here on Earth, but in the multidimensional plane where the Noralites originated, the celestial light beings who forged the universe as we know it, and their dark counterparts, the Jinn. So with that said, let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Before we start, I'd like to share something that will open your minds a little bit to what we're about to impart to you. The earth was once a realm of many names, a realm without end, vast without borders and edges, a bridge reaching the dimensions high and low, in which all the potential to channel. Density filtrated through the dimensions, solidifying within the lower realms to allow the formation of organic materials through panspermia. Organisms grew throughout the lower dimensions of the earth realm as the divine etheric consciousness sought to be among them.
In the beginning, it was said that God created man in its image, and they were. Naturally enlightened beings in the form of God's essence were conceived, Neuralite. She was the first of them, born a golem from Earth's natural clay of mud and light. Gaia raised a flawless mold. By her hand, Mother germinated pods of light within the trees to birth more. Each of them was perfect as individuals. Each of them was born of nature, of the same purity. Light resonated at their core, a part of the Creator within. Their transparent flesh was unblemished with hues of golden honey and sand. Manes flowed as wool and silk. Their skeletons were crystallized like diamonds refracting light. All of them were natural, without the cravings of want and need. They knew no concepts of time or death. They just were. Before the world knew of divisions and continents void of arrogance, they gathered on one infinite mass, an endless utopia lush with abundance. The timeless paradise knew only one name before it was coined Earth. It was known to the Neuralites under the guidance of Gaia as Pangea. They drank and bathed from the waters of 𝗙𝗏𝗏, but the world was not theirs. Before there was ever light, there was only darkness that swallowed the orb. It was the dark material essence purged from the Creator's being. It was Tartarus, and the world was his. Cold above and smoldering at the surface, the world was near lifeless with cracked surface and magma crawling through the crevices. Tartarus was the smoke and mist that blanketed the world. He and the sylph vapors that no longer traveled with the Creator held dominion. Bred from malice, derived from chaos, and born of tar, smoke, and ash, the jinn were molded. Tartarus was given a form divided into three, as Lucifer and Satan rose as extensions of him. However brief his physical state would be, Tartarus was set upon the world with wrathful fury known only to the devil. His world had been swept into shadow, whilst the chosen among the Creator flourished. The jinn were born polar opposites to their Neuralite counterparts. For everything beautiful about them, the jinn could best be described as hideous. Their transparent flesh was pale and ashen, often sickly in appearance. As the Neuralites had lights that resonated at their core, the jinn had black voids that swept through them, making them appear almost as shadows. Their skeletons were as dense as petrified oak. Often their hair was discolored and for many, stringy. Deformations made many of them appear horned, with knobs of bone protruding through points of the flesh. At a time when verbal dialect had not been formed, when spoken word threatened to cause cataclysms, they honed their whispers. They remained as shadows, not allowing their existence to be known. Yet the longer they loomed, the more time became apparent. Things wilted. They perished. The Neuralites, in their ignorance to it, remained near ageless as the world changed with subtlety around them.
Before the construct of this 3D universe, before the earth was solidified into this matrix, there was a clash between the realms of the higher and lower dimensions. The celestial beings hailed from the 7th, 6th, and 5th dimensions with etheric forms, plasma bodies, and born through the nature that was provided to them. But below, within the 4th dimension, was the dwelling that was what would become formed to be the construct of this universe. And the 3rd dimensional and lower vibrational beings originated within this plane. And when the light struck and pierced through the 3rd dimension, it created a rift within the lower vibrational beings that caused them to lash out. And we'll continue.
Creatures and beasts were large in stature, enormous yet grazing away from where mankind dwelled. With the creation of the Neuralites came the most exotic creatures to ever be revered. From the atmosphere, waters, and lands, they were the earthly spirits. The beasts themselves would lord over the air, the ground, and ravage the water. The earth created giant birds and large serpents, dragons for every terrain. It made hybrids of animals, altering genetic markers. Birds and wild beasts were fused, creating graceful predators. The arena of the wild had changed. Many of these creations became companions as pets, both for amusement and later for protection from the wild for the Neuralites. The world had become lush with variety.
Within the 4th dimension, as life was beginning to bud and physical beings began to walk the plane, majestic creatures that we've only known in our mythologies on the temple walls of different nations across the world. Griffins, sphinxes, dragons, they all existed, as well as polymorphic beings that resembled a hybrid sort of form between man and beast, centaur, satyrs, cryptids, and as well the hominin born from the density that was shed by the celestial beings, the prototypes for man, or the budding nations of mankind, all dwelled within this area. And they were close to more of the resonance of the third dimension, the hominin, though the majestic creatures were more adept toward the fifth dimensions. They were almost domesticated, but they were also the watchers and the guardians of the fourth dimensional realm.
Days were long, lasting what would seem to be years to a modern world. Nights were even longer. This was the age of horizon, and the nights, the terrors, belonged to jinn. They were patient, biding their time. At night they would carry their whispers on the wind, influencing the neuralites against their better judgments. They began to observe the nature around them, the animals that grazed the lands. They took notice of death with every animal that perished, succumbing to time or carnivorous acts. Animals were territorial, even the creatures they had bred, finding ways to dominate over various terrains. For the enlightened ones, it was incomprehensible. Then the whispers gripped them. Ideas were implanted within them that to better understand the dead, they must consume the flesh of the fallen. They must taste of the land, drink not only of the oceans, but taste the blood.
As the more celestial and etheric beings were drawn to this fourth dimensional plane, they were more susceptible to the whispers that the jinn carried on the winds that began to penetrate their thoughts and almost to an extent create a rift between the etheric beings with their telepathic links. They began to show more than a curiosity. They wanted to interact with these realms below. And before everything fell, before we created this construct, they wanted to become a part of the nature that they were creating.
The neuralites began to divide. They broke into tribal sects seeking new enlightenments. They bent matter. They knew no limits to physics. They were networked to the world, to its core. Yet it was not enough. They began rituals to honor the fallen beast by feeding from them, garnished by the fruits of the land. From this, impurities previously unknown to them had seeped into their very beings. The telepathic links were broken, forcing verbal and written dialect to form as a singular language, neuralition, natural speak. The once harmonious balance between them was finally being met with the conflict of dissension. They bore generations of children within their tribes. To maintain the peace they'd once known, they would often mingle and integrate into other tribes, either through betrothal or as nomads. The latter generations, though enlightened, had to be taught. They had to learn and adapt. More than language, neuralition was a unified spirituality, but its teachings varied and changed. It remained customary, though each individual had its differences, that they would reach a certain point of aging and cease, trapped perpetually at a certain age. It was their ignorance to finality that allowed them virtual immortality. Unknowing of true death, though the entity had predated even the first of them, Instead, to allow room for more to populate Pangea, they would commit their lights back to the Creator at the core of the earth that kept all of nature networked in harmony. They would give the essence given them back. Others, for fear of uncertainty, learned to bend light into space. The light that once shielded them, making them near invisible, had now been used to open the fabrics of space into the fourth dimensions and beyond, spanning elven planes. They began to ascend, reaching new celestial heights. They learned to create other existences outside of the realms that they'd known, binding with the cosmos, the Creator's third essence. Ripples and warps in space were the creations of other realms the sects would divide themselves into. They'd also discovered that there had been infinite alternate realities that had grown from unknown energies they'd emitted through the will of thought. They'd come to police these realms in the effort to reach newer heights of enlightenment and to keep the realms from converging on one another, whilst the elders and their chosen recreated themselves in new dimensions. The peoples of 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗴𝗃 began to wane from those who'd been at the dawn. They grew freer spirited, abandoning the natural laws of men.
This was a fragmenting. They began to fragment as they began to move away from each other. And for each sect that separated from the collective, this is the birth of the mythologies, the creation stories of all the nations. While they all did happen, they didn't necessarily happen on this plane, on this earthly plane. They began to identify themselves differently. They were the 𝗙𝗏𝗏, they were the 𝗍●, they were the 𝗏𝗏, the Anunnaki, the Nephilim, the giants, and all the other magnificent beings that the people would come to know. This was also the birth of a great and global empire. Most people referred to it as Atlantis, but in its inception, it was referred to as 𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗏. And this one language that they spoke, 𝗏𝗏, the language of nature, was the one dialect that each nation shared until they separated and got further into their own diversities. And we find now subtle shifts in language and subtle shifts in documentation of their histories. And all the while, this history is now manifesting within this fourth dimensional plane that is now closing to create this construct that is Earth. And the hominin are now being subject and beneficiaries to these manifestations.
Rivalries would grow between tribes. The most prominent of the tribes began to feud as the beast did for dominion and territory. They took to titles, giants and titans. The spawn of Gaia were very powerful, as were their betrothed and nomadic counterparts, as only they would have it. The giants were driven by the challenges of their opponent's strength. Outer conflicts were not the only threats from within the tribes. Fighting erupted between those constantly trying to vie for and usurp their leaders for power. The forging of weapons began through the natural alchemy of materials in the earth. Iron, bronze, diamond, even the material of stars were used to forge mighty steel the world would long forget. Weapons of divine forging. Never at that time had anything been crafted to do harm to another, but the world was changing. War pierced the hearts of each tribal sect, having arms turned against each other. They would fight to establish rule within a tribe before effectively pursuing territorial gain. Constant conflict between factions, both outward and inward, caused massive shifts within the plates that held the massive continent together. Raw, unbridled energy was wielded with abandon. Quakes and tremors threatened to divide the world in its geography. These beings, in all their strength, became recklessly destructive, and the jinn relished every moment of it. Finally, what used to be Pangea was divided in two.
This was a clash of realms. And with every clash of a weapon, every ill-spoken word, every blow thrown, created a stir within the fourth dimension. Storms and tectonic shifts and plates, typhoons, inclement weather. It had an adverse effect that was now starting to close the realms off from one another. And this was cementing the forging of the universe through chaos.
The damage inflicted upon the world was lasting, forever changing the balance of it. The once steady climate of the world began to change. Harsher weather began to ensue. Tones of flesh and grades of hair changed to fend off the elements. Days grew shorter. The division caused subtle changes in dialect and written word. To brand them with uniqueness, it became a purposeful trend. Dialects became unique to tribes. So too did separation become more defined. They took to branding and tattooing the flesh to identify themselves among each other. Eventually, many tribes found techniques for physical alterations to their appearance, elongating heads and stretching limbs to further set them apart. War continued between the two massive continents. What was once Pangea was no more. But new threats arose as the jinn set forth with their final attempt at creating a class of mankind they could rule in the Neanderthal. Unlike their brethren before, they were ever present, allowing themselves to be known. Brutish and strong, they bred with ogres, creating stronger races. Yet they were not what the jinn sought to create. An opportunity arose when the essence that was once so prevalent within the Neuralites was further diluted within their offspring. The light of the Creator no longer resided within. They grew weaker. They became smaller in stature. Their flesh varied, growing darker with pigment. It became more apparent that their abilities were growing limited. They were but shadows of their predecessors. With them, illness was born through their impurity. Allergy and disease would accost them. The elements were as much a danger as they were bound to those elements. Still, their greatest descent had not afflicted them.
When mankind was still budding, yet thousands of years have passed among the hominin, their skies began to change. And as they would look into the skies, they would start to see the appearance of stars. And this was their look into the realms, actually, as their universe was now being forged. The Neuralites, or the Celestials, whatever their position was within the higher realms, it represented something in the sky. Sirius, the Pleiades, and all the other constellations, Lyra, they were all beginning to take form based on the region in which they inhabited those realms. And the stars became inverted versions of their universes. To us, they looked like stars. To them, they were planets. And mankind, as it was being manipulated through the archons, the jinn, or what a lot of people refer to as reptilians, as they were manipulating the DNA of these hominin, and the Neanderthal came into prominence. They were trying to create something that they could both control and feed from, because their survival depended on it. They didn't have the advantages of the higher beings, so they depended on those that they were manipulating into becoming something else. And so the world was beginning to change in a large and grand way. At the same time, the celestial beings were also becoming more dense, and they were also losing that foothold of that fifth dimensional identity. And they were falling themselves, becoming more tethered to the fourth dimension than their predecessors.
The Neanderthals primarily populated one continent, unable to migrate beyond the borders of Laurasia. The other continent, Gondwana, was swelling with rampaging ogres and predatory trolls. The trolls were wrought with disease, creating adverse effects to their physiology. For many of them, papilloma mutated within their DNA, causing them to grow plant-like limbs, bark-like skin, and shrubbery that made them blend in with nature. Others would be hairless and pale, allergic to the radiance of sunlight, dwelling deep in caverns and camouflaging themselves among the stone wall of caves. The world had become a playground for jinn. Those who had ascended and become versed within the dimensions of realm had become aware of their shadowy threats. They were able to observe, to the detriment of their kin, the true cancer that ailed them. The cancer had already spread to the bone, yet there was hope. After ages of war between children and parents of the Titans, the newly established order set out to reunite the tribes. Creating a high council between their chosen leaders, they set out to reset the balance between the Neuralites. There were a few maidens that exhibited the purity to restore them to the enlightened beings they once were. One name in particular was sung more praise between the continents for her grace. Although her nature was quite precocious, Pandora had become a name as highly recognized as Gaia had once been. When the pigmented ones had been born, tribes were disbanded, leaving families to flee the harshness that would rain down on them for the impurity of the children. Pandora and several of others who had been chosen were to end the persecution that had befallen so many before. She was to be mated with the fallen titan Prometheus. Lucifer saw an opportunity that neither Satan nor the devil had had previously. In creating a world they could have just as much dominance and influence over, without creating more abominations. He sought to create a breed of man that would forever be ingrained with jinn essence and end the hopes of the repopulation of Neuralites.
Yes, the celestial beings began to lose their identity and further descend into the madness that was implanted in their minds by the jinn. As they took to titles, ego, entitlement, they lost sight of what was going on. Yet those of the higher realms, those celestials that resided within the sixth and seventh dimensions, they had clarity and they could see the puppet for the strings. They could see what was plaguing their kind. However, there was nothing that they could do to reach out and change this except for try to plant seeds that could bring them the hope of restoration. And so they sought the beings that were closest to purity, even though that they were no longer truly connected to source. And the jinn, in their agenda, had to move fast in order to finally create this race of being that even the playing field for both of them, but also that would also cement this construct into being what it is today.
To a neighboring tribal sect of women of spiritual sensitivity, an anomalous child was born, a child of spirit, having no father at conception. Her hair was as red as a river of blood. Her flesh was crystalline. Her lips blushed as deep as the pinkest rose. They called her Lilith. From her miraculous birth, she'd been determined as an infant to be betrothed to the first male born to restore the essence that had been lost to them. Through hypnosis, Lucifer was revealed to Prometheus. Lucifer took counsel with Prometheus, using his cunning to sway him. Lucifer convinced him that only the Titans could restore the Neuralites to their former glory, a marvelous ploy to gain the trust of the people, laying the seeds of the deception to come. By using what was already familiar to them, it made Lucifer's plan all the more foolproof. Lucifer entered Pandora's camp in the guise of Prometheus, under the veil of shadow and hypnosis. His pungent odor of gastric tar went unnoticed. The binding ritual between them was done, and on that eve he bedded her. This process was repeated throughout the regions with chosen maidens by those in his allegiance. The result was catastrophic. Pandora had given birth to Adam, the first male born of a new race of man. Neither enlightened nor completely impure, he was the first of humanity. The spiritual essence that would have been born to him was lost, born an entity, hope. Hope was not lost. It had become a presence of guidance, but would remain unseen for many ages. Feeling she was to blame for the deception that caused the birth of Adam, Pandora exiled herself, and Lilith was cast upon him to be Adam's wife when they were of age. Already a leper for her inception into the world, though there was regard for what prowess she may have possessed, there was very little compassion shown to her. She shared that with Adam before he was completely shunned. He had no ability, no true attributes. He was aging much faster than the others. Every day he was changing, but not evolving. Worse for him, even Lilith shunned him for not being her equal. She was unlike any other Neuralite. She was a clairvoyant medium able to see into dimensional space, able to see things others could not with the naked eye. She interacted with spirit essences, with the vapors of 𝗓 watching over the world. She saw demon essences. She, though a physical manifestation, was a part of that world. When Adam reached manhood, Lilith refused to be wed because he was inadequate and unable to keep pace with his tribe. He was cast out. That price was not only his, but Lilith's as well. For her inability to uphold her duty to the tribe and for her unsettling presence, she was sent out on her own, never to be interacted with or shown any favor. The act pierced her heart. She felt the devastation was for her unwillingness to nurture a lesser being, and thus placed the blame on him. She set out into the wilderness, creating a domain for herself. Her counsel, her companions, would be the spirits she'd come to embrace for so long. The 𝗓ths were vapors of the Creator, charged not to interfere or interact, but to guide in the most subtle of ways. Those who'd lost the enlightenment, though there were few that could not abide by that commandment. Lilith lay with the spirits, birthing entities she'd breed to terrorize the world of humanity, succubi and incubi. She learned to harness spiritual essence, to consume it, to tame it to her will. She, in essence, became a monstrous creature, ready to stalk her prey of humanity. She'd grown to embrace being an abomination, and with that, her hatred grew, not only for humanity, but for all of mankind. She lurked like a predator, watching from the outside, as she always had been. The women of her tribe, let alone any other, wanted her. She was natural, the most natural, yet not in the eyes of others, for when she was born, she had swallowed the essence of her mother at birth. Her mother had not lain with a man. Most of the women of her tribe maintained their virtue, shying away from the acts of men.
These women were the prototypes or the archetypes that would lay the foundation for what would later be known as the Amazonians. When Lilith was born, she was a pure manifestation from her mother, who while she wanted a child, didn't want to compromise her purity by engaging in the acts that had now sent the world spiraling out in turmoil. At the same time, when Adam was born completely disconnected from source because of the combination of the jinn and the celestial essence, which creates now that duality within people, the light and the dark. But this is also a source that can be either guided or manipulated. A food source for the jinn, vessels to inhabit or steer, or beacons that the celestial beings can use to try to pass and impart their messages in an effective way that mankind can find themselves somewhat closer to what they used to be. However, with the connection to the connection to source completely lost, it had become something else. I call it the hope entity in the story, but it's more than that. It's that thing that encompasses the consciousness of the minds of men that try to steer them and guide them in a direction to bring change in times where it's needed. Many of your great leaders were endowed with this. If you think JFK, if you think Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, if you think of the great seers like Edgar Casey, they were all touched by this, but more often than not, it would choose one particular vessel that maybe once a generation or once every other generation will be someone that stands out front and people will follow.
Adam for a time wandered the wilderness alone. Tremors in the earth continued to break the massive continents apart. Rivers, lakes, and seas he had not seen before began to flow and stream at edges and borders, slowly shifting the masses of land apart. Considerable small masses that did not drift far off in the water were swallowed by the rising tides. It wasn't long that he realized he'd drifted further from all he'd known. But he was not alone for long. Through the wilderness crept more humans. The nomads were led by a woman, Eve. It was almost instantly that they were smitten with each other. Together they led their small group of kindred until they rested upon a lush garden utopia they would come to call Eden. With a new beginning, they would become the first king and queen of humanity as equals. And again, isles and shores away on another land, there were two, Ask and Embla, who'd done just as Adam and Eve had. They were the forgotten, taking charge of the territory following the fallout of a war between realms. The giants and the newly entitled gods fought vigorously through space, leaving humanity the spoils. It was Odin who took favor toward them. With great sacrifice and the loss of an eye, he'd ensured their survival to claim land which the giants or any of his kind had claims to. It was from his realm of Asgard, forged with the energy of his forefathers, interconnecting 9 astral worlds, that he kept a watchful eye over them. The land Ask and Embla claimed for their pride of humanity was called Nod. It was quite the title for the grace Odin granted in his gesture of faith for the beings everyone else saw as lesser. However, it was Adam and Eve who were chosen by hope. Manifesting at the tree of knowledge as a voice, the entity sought to enlighten them. It gave them specific instructions for survival. The instructions were, as well, to keep a connection between it and the growing population of humanity. One instruction in particular was for their benefit. never to taste of the tree of knowledge, for the tree was a remnant of the original beings. What was contained in the fig was not for humanity. The tree of life stood as another remnant. The nectar of its bark flowed thick. The sap tasted sweet as honey. It maintained natural moisture-producing fluid dew. It granted them prolonged but not everlasting youth. But Satan was an ever-looming shadow. He chose Eve for her headstrong nature to influence her naive lover. He whispered through the belly of a serpent. Continually he implanted the ideas and nurtured them to convince her that there was nothing of the land they should not be privy to. Humanity had grown to hate their predecessors for abandoning them. They wanted nothing more than to be their equal, and it was by the fruit that she was convinced that they'd have that means. She harvested and fed it to the tribe, bringing rage from the entity that would be everlasting. The impurities of the fruit would bring them pains that humanity had yet to know. Before the entity departed, it gave them one last decree. If they were to ever leave the Garden of Eden, even at the expense of finding others, it would be forever lost to them. Their eyes would no longer have the ability to see it. With that, the voice was gone. The tree of life dried. They were alone once more.
This was an attempt to try to keep humanity at a certain vibration or frequency that would allow them to eventually ascend and gain another foothold back into the fifth dimensional consciousness. However, the jinn, because of their low vibration and their ability to influence, they could connect with more serpentine creatures that they could pass their messages through and use them to manipulate humanity further. They needed this food source, and so they could not allow them to ascend. And what we're finding now is the final collapse. This is the final phase that creates this construct for which we're stuck. And the third dimension is more of a purged realm that jettisons the materials that no longer resonate at a certain frequency, that allows it to chime into the fifth, sixth, and seventh dimensions. But the fourth dimension, being a part of humanity, time, it also fell into the third dimension. And what we're seeing now is the final division.
It wasn't long before this warning was ignored. They separated into groups to find and herd in more wandering souls, for it was certain they'd be abandoned to the wild. When they tried to return to the only place they'd known as home, their eyes were unable to see it through the veil cast over it. It was left to Adam to create a new Eden. It would be their empire, and hope, the entity of their guidance, had all but left them. It instead would serve them more silently, as it would choose individuals to spread its message through. Adam and all that followed him would have to wait for its chosen to rise. Empires would rise between humanity and Neuralites, but the essence of the Creator resided in all, and in time humanity birthed something similar to the Neuralites before them. Through them, remnants of their past were created through their genealogy. Neurals, gifted children with empathic abilities. They seemed even more connected to the earth than the men and women of their parentage. They exhibited abilities muted, yet similar to Neuralites: telepathy, telekinesis. They had abilities to manipulate matter. They manipulated time. Many grew to manipulate men. The Neuralites took notice. Through these new beings, they would become as gods. They latched on and influenced the Neurals to erect great kingdoms to lord over far-reaching lands. Humanity was subjugated to their children. Serving under these beings, it was only a matter of time before the tides would shift again. Hope was always with them. It was there to bring enlightenment to those lost in the darkness. When the tides of change were on the horizon, it was sure to rewrite history as it was known. History was left in the hands of humanity. No being greater than they would ever be given more credit. And so it was. Mankind traveled a winding road of lost identity. The balance of truth and story would be forever blurred. Many conflicts and struggles of power molded the world, warping it with lies. Yet hope still remains.
The moment the human stepped from the garden, they had stepped out of that reality. They had stepped out of that dimensional field that was holding them tethered between the fourth and fifth dimensions. And what they stepped into was a crumbling empire that once dominated the globe, and sects of hominin that so closely resembled them that they didn't know any different. And so they finally altered the DNA of the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and the other hominin subgroups to finally create what we are today. And in turn, because it was still and would always be a part of their genetics when they gave birth to the neural, that was something that you would consider like the demigods, or the sorcerers, the mages, the witches, the seers. And there was a time where they saw themselves above those who had parented them. And those celestial beings that had already fallen from grace so far felt themselves losing control over the globe. They used these beings to build or resurrect their empire, what you would think of as the Lemurians and the Atlanteans. Before all the dynastic periods of Kemet, before it turned Egypt, before the Sumerians, before Greece, before Rome, these were the people that laid those foundations, the forgotten ones. And with that, we'll put a cap on it. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to listen, and hopefully I'll see you again next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Brandon and Kimberly. Thank you all. And please join us again in the near future, or more accurately, sometime in the past. Bye for now.